Hello, thank you very much for having me, Norigin Media, and really looking forward to talking about sustainability and net zero. I actually wanted to start, though, with a bit of a story. So, anyone here in the audience play chess? You sort of, yeah, nods, hands up, great. So, this is the apocryphal, or the supposed story, or the legend of the origins of chess. So the story goes that in ancient Persia, a king wanted to design a board game for wars, and one of his advisors duly designed the game of chess. And the king was absolutely thrilled with this game, couldn't believe it, and offered the advisor great riches. And the advisor said, look, I have a very simple request. All I would like is 1 grain of rice on the first tile of the board, 2 grains of rice on the second tile of the board, 4 grains of rice on the third tile of the board, so doubling as we go. Now the king readily agreed, right? I mean, he thought he'd got a real bargain because that first row represents about 255 grains of rice, so barely enough for a roll of sushi. But what the king hadn't factored in was the enormous power of doubling or compounding or exponential growth. Because if you continue that same trajectory along, by the end of halfway through the board, you're talking about 280,000 kilograms of rice. And supposedly, if you continue on for the full grain of the board, it's more rice than's been cultivated on the planet in the last millennium. So the story goes that the king had to forfeit his kingdom to the advisor, but whatever the reasons for it, I started off with this story because it's one that mathematicians love when illustrating the power of compounding and potentially and specifically exponential growth. And I guess particularly for this topic of net zero, what we really need to see is exponential change. And in fact, it's such a key theme that there is a roadmap which is developed here in the Nordics, all about that topic, about how as a globe we can change. And so that will be a lot of the core thoughts and themes of this talk, right, which is what are the changes we can drive through that are not just marginal changes, but hopefully bigger changes that have a ripple effect throughout the industry. What I'll start, though, is probably a sort of a grim prognosis, which many of you will know about, but just starting with illustrating the challenge we have at hand. So the graph behind me is showing the annual average global temperatures since the 1880s, and really the onset of the global industrial revolution. So that said revolution brought about amazing changes to life expectancies and living standards, but has also put enormous strain on the planet, primarily through the use of fossil fuels. So the IPCC, which is the UN's global body, says that we should try and keep global warming to no more than 1.5 degrees compared to those pre-industrial times. The reality is that we're pretty much there now. So without dramatic intervention, we could be at 3 to 4 degrees. To give you some context, at a 1.5 degrees world, the IPCC say that that could still lead to 20 to 30% of species loss. At a 2-degree world, most ecosystems will struggle. So I've talked about chess, I've talked about this, and it all seems very irrelevant to you in your day job. And indeed, there was a business survey of UK businesses a couple of years ago that 91% felt overwhelmed, didn't know where to start, 56% said it was too late. But actually, I think that because we need to drive exponential change, every sector is impacted, and B, actually within this sector, there's some real tangible things that we can all do to contribute positively. So what I'm going to run through is 4 areas of focus, and then also dive into a little bit more about how it's done. Because as so often happens, you hear this sort of topic at a talk, and then you go away, and next week in the office it's all forgotten about. So what are the key traits? But before I do that, just to showcase the fact that globally, so many of the companies that you deal with, they could be customers of yours, suppliers of yours, have signed up to net zero targets and have signed up to stringent reductions of their emissions. Obviously, time will tell how much they achieved that, but we can all play a role in delivering that. The chart behind me is from the information communications technology sector. So again, in telecoms, most major operators have signed up to something around about this type of trajectory, which you can see is broadly halving emissions in a decade. I guess if you were to flip it and think how easy is it to double revenues of a sector, particularly a mature sector, in a decade, it's a challenge. So it goes without saying that it's a challenge here too. But to go into some of the specifics of what can be done, I thought I'd start off with Netflix. It's an obvious case. Looking at their latest publicly available data as to their carbon footprint. And this is the first key theme of what to focus on. I will not give you any more acronyms. The TV industry's got many of those already. So I will skip over what this all means. But scope 1 and 2 is really broadly your own operations. So think about that, like your offices, maybe data centers you might operate, other facilities that you have. That's only 3% of their carbon footprint. And in our business, we're a UK broadband operator. That's a 1%, right? And we have data centers and lots of other fun bits and bobs. But it just shows you that the scale of everything else that makes up the product and service that you deliver today is where the emissions are at. And in the case of Netflix, in the case of a company like TalkTalk and most other media and telecoms and technology companies, it will be particularly looking at your suppliers. So that's my first thought is how can you engage really positively with your suppliers and I guess go from that area of direct control to that sphere of influence, and that's where we can drive exponential change. Handily enough, what Netflix have also done is broken down their emissions by type. So you can see that production is a reasonably large percentage of emissions, and that does make sense. Streaming does come out quite small here at about 5%. Now, I don't doubt the numbers. I do think, however, that within the corporate bucket, you'll have a lot of supplier spend. And so some of that could be associated with the delivery of streaming services, CDN networks, data centers, etc. So 5% may not be a complete picture. The other thing that Netflix have done when looking at this is they have looked at the streaming end-to-end life cycle, and I think quite correctly what they've identified is that green coding, let's get of low coding or no coding or low bit rate infrastructure helps, but it doesn't dramatically help. And I would concur with that looking at our own networks, which is, we have certain energy usage. Now, whether that's low usage or peak usage of the energy of the broadband network, there's not a huge difference. But it does help, and that would be my second area of focus, is some kind of focus on green coding. But the other thing that the Netflix information shows is they've looked at where are the hotspots when you're streaming of the highest source of emissions. And what they've identified for their customers is at the end user in the home. So it's the electricity consumption and the devices that are needed for content streaming. So it could be broadband routers, TV set-top boxes, obviously the TVs themselves, streaming sticks. That's where the majority of their emissions lie. And again, I would concur that correlates very closely with our own data of what we see. So that brings me to the third what of what to focus on, which is devices. And so going, I guess, away from the virtual world and back towards kind of hard products themselves. What you can see on the graph behind you is that devices go through a very significant process, all the way from the raw materials that go into them, to then the assembly line in factories, to transportation, distributing them around the world, right the way through to how they're used by consumers for many years and the electricity that drives, and then finally finishing in end of life. So I think that's my first point, is actually devices have a surprisingly high carbon footprint because they go through so many stages. The second thought about devices, and we see this from all kinds of devices that we will procure. It could be broadband routers for customers, it could be enterprise-grade routers for business customers, mobile phones, TV set-top boxes, data center equipment. A very common theme, which is most of the carbon footprint itself, is actually typically in the use phase. So that's the electricity consumption for using that for year after year. And then in the raw material phase. So getting the components together, getting the chipsets and what have you, and all the raw materials together to create the device. So if you are to focus on devices, I think those two are important. Not to say that we shouldn't look at things like transporting, how to efficiently get these halfway around the world, but those two would be the big ones. So many of you in the room will be directly involved in procuring devices and working with that, but even if you're not and involved in software or middleware or slightly more indirectly involved, I just wonder whether there might be a way that what can you do that can help eke out the lifetime of a device, that can extend the longevity, or that can, for example, make refurbishment and repair of devices much simpler. I'll talk a bit about that later on, about what we've been doing there and both the cost and emission savings that we've seen. So then going on to the fourth area of the what, if you like. Again, I tried to make this local to the market. So I had a good look around Telenor and their carbon footprint. So a few interesting observations. So first of all, as I said, a bit like Netflix and common to the first area, even though Telenor is quite a large organization with lots of offices and lots of their own operations, consistently it's the supply chain, all those partners that they buy from, it remains the largest source of their emissions. But the second interesting area, and apologies for the colors, but is about 21% is what I've dubbed and sort of bucketed into a sort of operations and energy, so thinking about their energy consumption. And that is quite high if you compare it to other telecoms operators and media operators in the segment. So when you delve into that, the reason is that Telenor have operations in the Nordics and Europe, but then they also have operations in Asia. And when you look at those numbers, the Nordics emissions associated with their energy consumption is only 2% of that of Asian operations. So the reason why is quite simple: a much higher use of renewable and clean energy, in their European operations. So sounds obvious, but really hopefully stresses the point that in any way possible where you can adopt clean energy both in your own operations and in the operations of maybe even your suppliers, has that really significant opportunity to make a big difference. So we've talked a bit about the 4 whats, or what are the key areas that we can all do in terms of focus. And again, I think it's about how we extend that sphere of influence, particularly to our suppliers, as how we engage on our coding, how we engage with specifically with devices, and then finally clean energy. Now, what I wanted to then also talk a bit more was about the how, because as I mentioned, and I do this full-time for a living, it's very hard to actually change the culture of businesses and to keep this at the forefront, right? Because I really do believe for this sector, a little bit of foresight and work can be done at a very low cost level and actually yield huge dividends. But even that small piece of effort can often be overlooked. So both looking at what we've done in our own business, but more importantly, looking at others that are, doing even better than myself, I've tried to distill down 3 traits or cultures of successful, sustainable organizations, and hopefully they'll be of interest and use. So the first one is being open to learn, so making time to learn about the topic. So it sounds pretty obvious, but so often doesn't happen. Now, I included this quote because, again, being in Oslo, I had to have a quote from a Norwegian, and so I'm sure many of you will recognize the name, Brundtland, former Norwegian Prime Minister. And so the second reason I've put this quote up is because it is a definition of sustainability, and probably one of the first definitions that there was. And again, it's a term that's bandied around a lot. And so here you go. That's the definition, probably the official definition. But the third reason I've put this up on the board is that this report is from all the way back in 1987. And I think if we're being honest with ourselves, we know that this topic, sustainability more broadly, climate change more specifically, has been around with us for a very long time, but it's not necessarily been integrated into the business rhythm and cycle as early and as often as it should have. But actually, I think the reality is that so many other new things come along, and they do get integrated into the business cycle. They do become key and intrinsic to decision-making that businesses do. So I wonder if you guys can complete the phrases. Anyone know what the letter is that's missing there? D, absolutely. So GDPR. So no, probably not everyone's favorite topic, but the point is that this is something now that when you're bringing a new product or service to market, I bet you'll be thinking about what the data protection implications are. Or let's try a different one. This is a bit harder, it's not legislative. Anyone got this one? NPS, Net Promoter Score, right? So a way of quantifying and I guess having that data and evidence around customer satisfaction. And again, in my previous job to this, running our TV service, I remember many times presenting a business case, and one of the key questions is, aside from the financials, what will this do to our NPS score? So all of a sudden, you had to become an expert in quantifying and understanding, analysis on customer satisfaction. So my point here is that, we've had waves of new changes that are maybe not quite core to your business coming through before, and I believe that, sustainability's time is now. The missing acronym there is R, CSRD, which is an EU legislation, which is this year, last year. But the point being that openness to learn is the key criterion, right? The second trait that we see for successful, sustainable businesses is what I would call that allowing of bottom-up thinking to flourish. So, for example, at our business, we have net zero targets, which have been set, and absolutely, they were quantified at senior management level, approved by the board, and then set as the agenda for the company. But at the same time, what I found is actually true success is when all employees can actually embrace it. And part of that embracing it is to have the autonomy to contribute towards those goals. So I wanted to give you a couple of examples in our own organization. We use Microsoft tools, and one of the things, much to the probably annoyance of some staff members, is that the default search engine is Microsoft Bing. Now, a colleague of mine in a completely different department saw this and also observed that there's a website called Ecosia, which I don't know if you're familiar with, but it uses Microsoft Bing as the search engine tool, but it diverts that ad income it generates to planting trees. So went through security teams, IT teams, obviously it's completely free for us. That's actually been, we've now planted about 15,000 trees just by changing something simple like that. So again, that's an idea that frankly I just didn't have, so it wouldn't have come from me. And then on the right-hand side, I talked a bit more about devices, and this was again a colleague of mine, a very young colleague, kind of in his 20s, won a sort of award, which is this shiny thing, which was all around our efforts on, particularly about refurbishment of devices. So he really took it upon himself to go above and beyond and examine the challenge, right? How do we make sure that we are getting back from our customers routers, set-top boxes, and other types of devices? And actually realizing that it's less of an operational or technological challenge, but fundamentally a consumer one. How do you persuade the consumer? And it's not always through environmental messaging. It's often just through ease. How do you make it convenient for them? And anyway, the result of his work is not only award-winning, but we save about £10 million a year and about 4,500 tons of carbon dioxide equivalents through a successful refurbishment program. And again, while some of that may have happened, certainly the direction was there, I think that level of internal autonomy helped really accelerate it to something more meaningful. And then the third trait, and I would actually probably argue this is the most important of the three traits, is how can you integrate this topic into your product design or into your initiation of projects? Because it will be, I think, far cheaper and also far more effective if it can be considered from the origins, from the start. And probably to illustrate this, nothing to do with sustainability at all, but I love this story, so I'll tell this one as well, about apparently there was an American automotive executive that went to Japan, this is years ago, 50, 60 years ago, to look at the assembly line and how they operated. And he was going through, and most of the assembly line was nearly identical to what he was used to. But then at the very end of the process, he noticed that in his own assembly line back home, there was one person, and their job with a sort of very gentle hammer was just to gently tap the edges of the doors to make sure they fit nice and snugly into the final car before it rolled out. So he asked the interpreter, right, why you've got sort of one person missing, why is that? And the interpreter somewhat sheepishly had to reply that, look, when we design it to be perfect first time. So that's just the power of design. If we can design the processes seamlessly, we can hopefully make something really powerful. I thought I couldn't finish a presentation without mentioning crypto or AI. Having mentioned AI, I'm not even going to talk about it, sadly, but I do want to talk about crypto, and particularly because in preparation for this event, I was reading, not a new study, this is a study from a number of years ago by some academics who looked at the carbon footprint of Bitcoin, and they believed it to be higher than the carbon footprint of Norway. So I thought, well, that's very interesting. I've got to talk about it here. So if I break that down a bit as to why is it, and hopefully that can be a good wrap-up to think about how we can integrate some of the stuff we talked about earlier on in the presentation. So why is the carbon footprint so high? Well, there's two primary reasons. The first is the essence of the product, or the essence of generating income is mining. And so mining is an energy-intensive process. It is then compounded by the electricity that's often used. So historically, that might be China, more latterly, countries like Uzbekistan, with their electricity grids are highly driven by coal-powered, so a lot, let's say, dirtier than power grids in the Nordics, for an example. So if we were to flip that, and if we were to start a cryptocurrency here, all of us in this room, and learning some of those things that we talked about earlier, could we create something where the incentive was somewhere around energy efficiency somehow? And could we augment that with clean power? And then could we also make sure that when we're using our suppliers and our partners and all that ecosystem that use it, we positively influence? And I think if we could do that, we could create a currency of sort of exponential positive change and impact. So with that, look, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. And as I said, I would really implore you, if you can, not to quit at this. And when you get back into the office next week, to consider at least one thing that you can do to hopefully accelerate the transition to net zero for your company. Thank you.